The bright morning sun streamed through the windows of Denver International Airport as James Wilson hurried toward his gate. At 42, James carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent most of his adult life in the cockpit of commercial airliners. Today, however, he wasn't wearing his captain's uniform with its 4 golden stripes. James checked his watch and smiled. He had plenty of time before his flight to Atlanta, where he was scheduled to captain a transatlantic flight the following morning. His airline had booked him in first class, a standard practice when deadheading pilots to their next assignment. After 15 years of flying, such perks had become routine, but James never took them for granted. Final boarding call for Flight 285 to Atlanta. The announcement echoed through the terminal as James approached the gate. Perfect timing, he muttered to himself, joining the short line of late-arriving passengers. The gate agent smiled professionally as she scanned his boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight, sir." James nodded his thanks and made his way down the jet bridge. As he stepped onto the aircraft, the familiar smell of recycled air and cleaning products greeted him. A flight attendant stood at the entrance, greeting passengers with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard," she said without making eye contact, already looking past him to the next passenger. James turned left toward the first-class cabin. He found his seat, 2C, an aisle seat in the second row. He stored his small carry-on bag in the overhead bin and settled into the spacious leather seat. A few other passengers were already seated in the first-class cabin, most of them tapping away on laptops or scrolling through phones. As James fastened his seatbelt, a different flight attendant approached. She was tall with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her name tag read Karen. She stopped beside his seat, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Excuse me, sir. This is the first-class cabin," she said, her voice carrying just enough for nearby passengers to hear. James looked up, momentarily confused. "Yes, I know. I'm in 2C. He reached for his boarding pass in his pocket and held it out to her. Karen glanced at it but made no move to take it. "May I see your ID as well?" she asked, her tone suggesting this was standard procedure. James felt a familiar tightening in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. He'd been in similar situations before. He pulled out his driver's license and handed it to her along with the boarding pass. Karen studied both documents, looking between them and James's face several times. "Just a moment," she said, walking away with his ID and boarding pass. James sat quietly, aware that several passengers had looked up from their devices and were watching the interaction. A white businessman in his 50s boarded and took the seat across the aisle. Karen immediately approached him with a warm smile. "Can I get you a pre-departure beverage, sir?" she asked. "Scotch. Neat? Please," the man replied without looking up from his phone. Karen nodded and walked away, still holding James's documents. A minute later, she returned with another flight attendant, a middle-aged man whose name tag read Steve. "Sir, there seems to be a problem with your boarding," Steve said quietly. "This seat is reserved for our premium customers." James took a deep breath. "I am aware. As you can see from my boarding pass, I was assigned this seat. I'm deadheading to Atlanta for tomorrow's flight to London. I'm a captain with this airline." Steve and Karen exchanged glances. "Do you have your company ID?" Steve asked. "It's in my checked luggage with my uniform," James explained. "But you can easily verify my employment status through the system." More passengers filed past, the boarding process continuing around this increasingly uncomfortable confrontation. A few curious glances turned their way as Karen's voice grew louder. "Sir, if you can't provide proper identification confirming your status, I'll need to ask you to move to your correct seat," she insisted. James remained calm, though his heart was racing. "There is no correct seat. This is my assigned seat, as shown on my boarding pass which you're currently holding." The tension in the first-class cabin was palpable. An elderly white woman sitting behind James leaned forward. "Is there a problem?" she asked no one in particular. Karen turned to her with a reassuring smile. "No problem, ma'am, just a seating confusion we're sorting out." James knew what was happening. It wasn't the first time, and sadly, he doubted it would be the last. He had two choices: cause a scene and potentially delay the flight, or swallow his pride and dignity once again. The captain's voice came over the PA system. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." Time had run out for discussion. I need to ask you to move to the main cabin for now, Steve said, lowering his voice. We can sort this out after takeoff. James looked around the first-class cabin. Several passengers were now openly watching the situation unfold. The businessman across the aisle glanced up from his phone, frowned slightly, then returned to his screen. May I at least have my ID back? James asked, extending his hand toward Karen. She hesitated before returning his driver's license but kept the boarding pass. I'll need to verify this with the gate agent, she said. James stood up, his 6'2" frame now towering over both flight attendants. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, aware that any sign of frustration might be misinterpreted. 15 years of flying had taught him how to maintain composure in tense situations. You know what? It's fine, he said quietly. I'll sit wherever you want me to sit. A young woman seated in the row behind him spoke up. Wait, I saw his boarding pass. It definitely said 2C. I don't understand what the problem is. Karen turned to her with a tight smile. Ma'am, we have procedures we need to follow. Everything is under control. James collected his carry-on from the overhead bin. As he did, he noticed a man in the last row of first class discreetly holding up his phone, its camera lens pointed in their direction. The man quickly lowered it when he saw James looking. As James stowed his bag and squeezed into the tight space, he pulled out his phone. With practiced efficiency, he typed out a text message to his chief pilot. Being bumped from deadhead first-class seat on Flight 285 to ATL. Maybe delayed reaching London assignment. Possible discrimination incident. Will call upon landing. Captain Wilson. He sent the message just before the announcement to put phones in airplane mode. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, and James stared out the window over the sleeping man's shoulder, his jaw clenched tight. 20 minutes into the flight, a gentle tap on his shoulder interrupted James's thoughts. He looked up to see a different flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair, standing in the aisle. Captain Wilson, she whispered. James nodded, surprised to hear his title. I'm Susan, she said. I recognized you from the Atlanta Crew Lounge. I'm so sorry about what happened. I've informed Captain Reynolds about the situation. James felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. Thank you, Susan, but I don't want to cause any trouble. Susan shook her head. It's already been handled poorly. Captain Reynolds asked me to check if you need anything. I'm fine, James replied, though the knot in his stomach suggested otherwise. As Susan walked away, the teenage boy beside James removed his headphones. You're a pilot? He asked, eyes wide with interest. James nodded. Yes, I am. That's so cool. Why aren't you flying the plane? James smiled despite himself. I'm heading to my next assignment. Pilots often travel as passengers to get where they need to be. And they wouldn't let you sit in first class? That's messed up. The simple honesty in the boy's assessment hit James hard. It was indeed messed up, but he'd faced this kind of treatment before, at upscale restaurants, in hotel lobbies, and even in the cockpit when passengers did a double take upon seeing him in the captain's seat. From across the aisle, a middle-aged woman leaned over. I saw what happened up front, she said quietly. I was going to say something, but everything happened so fast. James nodded politely, but didn't respond. What could be said? The familiar weight of these experiences settled over him like a heavy blanket. Halfway through the flight, James noticed Karen walking through the cabin, avoiding eye contact as she passed his row. Behind her, Steve was pushing the beverage cart, looking uncomfortable when he spotted James. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the fasten seatbelt sign to ding on. As the aircraft bounced through rough air, James instinctively assessed the severity. Moderate chop, nothing concerning. The teenage boy clutched the armrests. It's just air pockets, James explained calmly, like driving on a bumpy road. The boy relaxed slightly. How can you tell when it's bad turbulence? As James began explaining the difference between types of turbulence, he noticed Susan walking purposefully toward him, determination in her eyes. She stopped at his row and leaned in close. Captain Reynolds would like to speak with you in the cockpit when we land, she whispered. He's not happy about how this was handled. James nodded, wondering what the captain had in mind. The flight still had an hour to go, and already this simple deadhead trip had become far more complicated than he'd ever anticipated. The flight continued with James attempting to distract himself by chatting with the teenage boy beside him. The young passenger, who introduced himself as Marcus, was flying alone to visit his father in Atlanta. "So you fly big planes like this one?" Marcus asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. James nodded. "This exact model, actually. I've been flying the Boeing 737 for about 8 years now." "That's awesome. Do you fly all over the world?" "Mostly North America and Europe," James explained. "Tomorrow I'm scheduled to fly from Atlanta to London." Their conversation made the time pass more quickly, but James couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that lingered from the incident. Throughout his career, he had worked twice as hard to earn the respect that seemed to come automatically to his white colleagues. The 4 stripes on his uniform usually offered some protection from such treatment, but without them, he was just another black man being told he didn't belong in a premium space. 40 minutes before landing, Susan returned with a bottle of water and a first-class meal that she discreetly handed to James. Captain Reynolds insisted. She whispered with a wink. James accepted the gesture with a quiet thank you, though food was the last thing on his mind. He was more concerned about what awaited him in Atlanta. Would he still make his connection? Would there be an investigation that might delay his London flight? The question swirled in his mind as the plane began its initial descent. As the aircraft approached Atlanta, the seatbelt sign dinged. James noticed Karen moving through the cabin, checking that tray tables were up and seatbelts were fastened. When she reached his row, she barely glanced at him before moving on. "She still thinks she was right," Marcus observed quietly. James gave a small smile. "It happens." The intercom crackled to life, and the voice of Captain Reynolds filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final approach into Atlanta. We'll be landing in approximately 20 minutes. Weather in Atlanta is clear, 72 degrees. Local time is 2:15 p.m. There was a pause, and then the captain continued, his voice taking on a different tone. "Before we land, I'd like to address a situation that occurred during boarding. It has come to my attention that one of our passengers was improperly removed from his assigned first-class seat." A murmur rippled through the cabin. James felt his stomach tighten. This passenger, seated in 18E, is Captain James Wilson, one of our airline's most experienced pilots. Captain Wilson will actually be commanding tomorrow's flight from Atlanta to London. The teenage boy beside James turned to him with wide eyes. Several passengers in nearby rows twisted in their seats to look at him. "I want to personally apologize to Captain Wilson for this unfortunate incident. Our airline prides itself on treating all passengers with dignity and respect. What happened today falls far short of that standard." James sat perfectly still, his face carefully neutral despite the emotions churning inside him. This public acknowledgement was unprecedented in his experience. The captain paused again before adding, "I've instructed our ground team to have a customer service representative meet our flight to ensure Captain Wilson is properly accommodated for the remainder of his journey. Thank you for your attention. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." The cabin buzzed with whispers. Marcus grinned at James. "That was awesome." The captain totally called them out. From across the aisle, the middle-aged woman who had spoken to him earlier nodded in approval. "About time someone stood up for what's right," she said. James noticed Karen standing frozen in the galley, her face pale. Steve was beside her, speaking urgently in hushed tones. Susan caught James's eye from the front of the cabin and gave him a subtle thumbs up. As the plane descended through the clouds, James's phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from his chief pilot. "Heard about incident. Reynolds filled me in. VP of Flight Ops wants to speak with you when you land. Don't worry, you're not in trouble." "They are?" James took a deep breath. What had started as a routine deadhead flight had somehow transformed into something much more significant. He wasn't naive enough to believe that one incident could change systemic problems, but perhaps it was a start. The aircraft touched down smoothly on the Atlanta runway, and as it taxied toward the gate, James prepared himself for whatever came next. One thing was certain: this was far from over. The aircraft came to a complete stop at the gate. As passengers began to stand and collect their belongings, James remained seated, unsure of the protocol in this unusual situation. The teenage boy next to him, Marcus, gave him an encouraging smile. I bet they're going to give you free flights for a year or something, Marcus said with the optimism of youth. James chuckled. I don't think that's how it works, but I appreciate your positive thinking. The cabin doors opened, and Susan appeared at his row. Captain Wilson, if you could wait until the other passengers have deplaned, Captain Reynolds would like to speak with you. James nodded and settled back into his seat. He watched as passengers filed past, many glancing at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy. A few stopped briefly to offer words of support. What happened to you was wrong, said an elderly woman with silver hair. I hope they make it right. Thank you, ma'am, James replied politely. The middle-aged businessman who had been seated across from him in first class paused as he passed. For what it's worth, I heard how they spoke to you. As the last passengers made their way out, Karen and Steve stood awkwardly in the forward galley, avoiding eye contact with James. The cabin emptied until only the crew and James remained. Captain Reynolds emerged from the cockpit. He was older than James, perhaps in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the sky. He walked directly to where James sat. Captain Wilson, he said, extending his hand. Michael Reynolds. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. James stood and shook his hand. Thank you for what you said on the announcement. You didn't have to do that. Reynolds shook his head. Actually, I did. What happened was unacceptable. He gestured toward the front of the plane. Walk with me. As they moved forward, James noticed Karen and Steve had disappeared, likely exiting through the forward door. Only Susan and the first officer remained in the forward cabin. This is First Officer Davis, Reynolds said, introducing the younger pilot. Captain Wilson, Davis said with respect in his voice. It's an honor. I've heard about your work with the pilot mentorship program. James was surprised that his reputation had reached this crew. His work mentoring young pilots from underrepresented backgrounds was something he was proud of, but he hadn't realized it was widely known. There's someone waiting to speak with you in the terminal, Reynolds continued. But before that, I want you to know that I've filed a formal incident report. This isn't going to be swept under the rug. James sighed. I appreciate that, but I don't want anyone to lose their job over this. Reynolds' expression was serious. This isn't about one incident or one employee, Wilson. It's about a pattern that needs to change. You know as well as I do that this wouldn't have happened if you had been wearing your uniform, and it certainly wouldn't have happened if you were white. The bluntness of Reynolds' statement caught James off guard. In his experience, white colleagues rarely acknowledge the reality of racial bias so directly. The company has been talking about diversity and inclusion for years, Reynolds continued. Lots of nice words in memos and training sessions. But when it comes to actual behavior, moments like this tell the real story. Susan approached with James's carry-on bag. I retrieved this from the overhead bin for you, Captain. Thank you, James said, taking the bag. As they walked toward the aircraft door, Reynolds lowered his voice. The passenger in 5D recorded part of the incident. It's already on social media. James felt a mix of emotions at this news. While part of him wanted the truth to be known, another part dreaded becoming the center of a viral controversy. Our VP of Flight Operations is waiting in the terminal, Reynolds said. Lisa Chen. Do you know her? James shook his head. We've never met, but I know who she is. She's good people, Reynolds assured him. Straight shooter. She flew out from headquarters as soon as she heard. They stepped into the jet bridge together. First Officer Davis and Susan stayed behind to complete their post-flight duties, each giving James a respectful nod as he left. Whatever happens next, Reynolds said as they walked toward the terminal, know that you have allies. More than you might think. James felt a complex mix of emotions, gratitude for Reynolds' support, anxiety about what lay ahead, and a deep weariness with having to navigate these waters at all. He had just wanted to get to his next assignment. Instead, he had become the involuntary face of an issue much larger than himself. As they approached the end of the jet bridge, James squared his shoulders and prepared to meet whatever awaited him in the terminal. As James and Captain Reynolds emerged from the jet bridge into the busy terminal, a small group of people stood waiting. In the center was a petite Asian woman in a crisp navy suit, her expression serious, not unkind. Next to her stood a tall black man in his 60s wearing the uniform of the airline's senior management. 4 gold stripes gleaming on his shoulders. "Captain Wilson," the woman stepped forward, extending her hand. "I'm Lisa Chen, Vice President of Flight Operations. This is Marcus Johnson, our Chief Pilot for the Eastern Region." James shook both their hands, recognizing Marcus Johnson immediately. The man was something of a legend, one of the first black pilots to reach senior management at the airline, and someone James had admired from a distance throughout his career. "I wish we were meeting under different circumstances," Chen said, echoing Reynolds' earlier sentiment. "We got a private room where we can talk." She gestured toward a corridor leading away from the main concourse. As they walked, James noticed a few passengers from his flight watching the procession. The teenage boy, Marcus, waved enthusiastically from where he stood with an adult who must have been his father. James returned the wave with a small smile. They entered a conference room typically reserved for crew briefings. Inside, a customer service representative waited with a laptop open before her. "This is Andre from our customer relations team," Chen explained. "She'll be taking notes on your account of what happened." James took a seat at the table, placing his carry-on beside him. "I appreciate everyone's concern, but I'm not sure all this is necessary. These things happen. I'd just like to get to my hotel and prepare for tomorrow's flight." Chief Pilot Johnson took the seat across from him. "James, may I call you James?" When James nodded, he continued, "We're not here just because of what happened to you today. We're here because what happened to you has happened to others, and it will continue to happen unless we address it directly." Chen nodded in agreement. "The video is gaining traction online. We need to respond appropriately, not just with a public statement but with meaningful action." James felt his stomach tighten. "There's really a video?" Reynolds pulled out his phone and opened a social media app. He placed it on the table and turned it toward James Usend. "Ja." "No one ever does," Johnson said gently. "But sometimes these moments choose us, not the other way around." Andrea spoke up for the first time. "Captain Wilson, we'd like to hear your account of what happened, in your own words. Then we can discuss next steps." James took a deep breath and recounted the incident from the beginning. The initial questioning, the repeated demands for ID, the way Karen had kept his boarding pass, and how he had ultimately been relegated to a middle seat in economy rather than causing a scene. As he spoke, Andrea typed rapidly, occasionally asking him to clarify specific details. Chen's expression grew increasingly troubled, while Johnson nodded occasionally, as if nothing in James's story surprised him. When James finished, Chen leaned forward. "First, let me say unequivocally that what happened was wrong and completely at odds with our company values. I want to personally apologize to you." "I appreciate that," James said. "Second," she continued, "I want you to know that we're taking immediate action. We've already spoken with the flight attendants involved. They've been removed from duty pending a full investigation." James frowned. "I don't want anyone to lose their job over this." "This isn't just about one incident," Chen explained. "Our preliminary review suggests this isn't the first time Karen Winters has shown problematic behavior. There have been other complaints that weren't properly addressed." Captain Reynolds, who had been quiet since showing James the video, spoke up. "The announcement I made was my personal decision. I hope it didn't make things more difficult for you." "Actually," James said, "it was the first time in my career that I've felt truly supported in a situation like this. Usually, these things are brushed aside or handled in private, if at all." Johnson nodded approvingly at Reynolds. "Sometimes leadership means taking a public stand, even when it's uncomfortable." Chen checked her watch. "James, your flight to London is scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow. We'd like to offer you a suite at the airport hotel tonight, and of course, we'll make sure your crew is briefed that there should be no issues whatsoever." James nodded, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to him. "There's one more thing," Chen added. "We'd like you to consider being part of the solution going forward." James looked at Chen with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Being part of the solution? What exactly do you mean?" Chen exchanged glances with Johnson before continuing. "Our diversity training program has been less effective than we hoped. It's mostly online modules that people click through without real engagement. We need someone with first-hand experience to help develop something more meaningful." "You want me to be the face of your new diversity initiative?" James asked, unable to keep a hint of skepticism from his voice. Johnson leaned forward. Not exactly. We want your expertise, your perspective. This wouldn't be a PR exercise, James. This would be about creating real change from within. Before James could respond, there was a knock at the door. Andrea opened it to reveal Susan, the kind flight attendant from the plane. Susan took a seat next to Reynolds as Chen turned back to James. Spiraled into something he could no longer control. I just want to fly my route tomorrow and move on with my life, he said quietly. I understand, Chen said sympathetically, but sometimes life has other plans. Johnson's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his eyebrows rose. The CEO is on his way to Atlanta. He wants to meet with Captain Wilson personally. The room fell silent. Even Chen looked surprised. Raymond Green is coming here. Now? Johnson nodded. His assistant says he saw the video and immediately arranged for the corporate jet. Reynolds let out a low whistle. I've been with this airline for 27 years. I've never seen Green respond to anything this quickly. James felt a headache coming on. All of this seems excessive for what happened. Susan, who had been quiet since entering, spoke up. Captain Wilson, I don't think you understand what that video shows. It's not just about you being asked to move. It's about the contrast between how you were treated and how the white passengers were treated. It's painfully obvious, and people are responding to that. Andrea turned her laptop toward James. The screen showed social media reactions pouring in by the minute. This is exactly what happens to black professionals every day. Credentials questioned, dignity stripped away. I've flown this airline for years. Canceling my loyalty card today. If they treat their own pilots like this, imagine how they treat regular black passengers. James stared at the comments, reality sinking in. This had become much bigger than him. Chen's phone rang. She answered it briefly, then looked up. Raymond Green will be here in 30 minutes. He's asked that Captain Wilson stay for the meeting. James nodded, resigned to the fact that his quiet evening of preparation for tomorrow's flight was not to be. While we wait, Johnson said, there's something else we should discuss. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. James, your personnel file shows you've experienced similar incidents before. James tensed. I've never filed a formal complaint. No, but there are notes from 3 separate chief pilots over the years, documenting incidents you mentioned in passing. Being questioned in the cockpit by passengers, difficulty accessing the flight deck at foreign airports, even an incident where airport security detained you despite your uniform and credentials. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had always tried to handle these situations quietly, to be professional and not make waves. Why didn't you ever file formal complaints? Chen asked gently. James thought carefully before answering. When I was coming up through the ranks, the message was clear. Being seen as difficult or playing the race card could end a career. So I did what most of us do, kept my head down and focused on being twice as good. Johnson nodded knowingly. I took the same approach in my day, but times are changing, James, and maybe they need to change faster. Reynolds, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. What happened today shouldn't have happened, period, and my announcement shouldn't have been necessary. But we all know that if you've been wearing your uniform, or if you've been white, Karen wouldn't have questioned you in the first place. Susan nodded in agreement. I've worked with Karen for 5 years. She has patterns in how she treats certain passengers. Chen made a note. That's valuable information for the investigation, Susan. The conference room door opened again, and a young assistant poked her head in. Mr. Green's plane has landed. They'll be here in 15 minutes. As the door closed, James looked around the room at the faces watching him expectantly. He realized that whether he wanted it or not, he had become the center of a moment that might actually lead to meaningful change. The question was, what would he do with this unexpected platform? The atmosphere in the conference room grew tense as they awaited the CEO's arrival. James checked his watch nervously. It was nearly 4:00 p.m., and his mind drifted to his scheduled flight tomorrow. Would he still be commanding it? Should he even want to, given the circumstances? Susan offered him a bottle of water, which he accepted gratefully. The door opened, and everyone instinctively stood as Raymond Green entered the room. Green was tall and imposing, in his early 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He wore no tie with his expensive suit, giving him the casual authority of someone who didn't need formality to command respect. "Captain Wilson," he said, moving directly to James and extending his hand. "Raymond Green. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." James shook his hand firmly. So does everyone, it seems. Green's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "I believe in addressing problems directly and immediately, particularly when they reflect poorly on the culture I'm responsible for creating." He nodded to the others in the room but kept his focus on James. "I've watched the video. I've also reviewed your service record. 15 years with our airline. Perfect safety record. Hundreds of commendations from passengers. And multiple incidents of discrimination that you never formally reported." James shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Green." "Ray, please." "Ray?" James corrected himself. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not interested in becoming the center of a corporate PR campaign." Green smiled genuinely this time. "Good. Neither am I. I despise those empty gestures." He took a seat at the head of the table and gestured for everyone else to sit as well. "What I am interested in is fixing a systemic problem that's clearly festered for too long." He turned to Chen. "Lisa, where are we with the immediate response?" Chen straightened. "Karen Winters and Steve Matthews have been suspended pending investigation. We're preparing a public statement acknowledging the incident and our commitment to addressing it. Captain Reynolds' actions have been noted positively in the record." Green nodded. "And the video?" "Nearly 1 million views across platforms," Andrea reported. "Traditional media has picked it up now. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News." James leaned forward slightly. "I'm listening." "Option 1, Green said, we issue a standard corporate apology, you continue on your schedule as planned, and we handle this internally. The story will likely fade in a few days, though not before damaging our reputation and, frankly, misleading the public about how seriously we take this." He paused to let that sink in before continuing. "Option 2, we address this head-on, with you involved in whatever capacity you're comfortable with. Not as a token or a symbol, but as a professional whose expertise and experience are valuable in solving a real problem." The room was silent as James considered the CEO's words. Part of him wanted to choose option 1, to retreat to the familiar comfort of his cockpit and leave the messy business of institutional change to others. But another part of him, perhaps the more important part, recognized this as a rare opportunity. What exactly would option 2 entail? James asked carefully. Green looked to Johnson, who took his cue. "We'd like to establish a task force on inclusive practices," Johnson explained. "Not just for passengers but for crew members as well. We want to examine everything from hiring practices to customer service training. We'd like you to co-chair it, along with Lisa." James raised an eyebrow. "Co-chair with the VP of Flight Operations? That's a significant commitment." "It is," Green agreed. "We'd adjust your flying schedule accordingly and compensate you for the additional responsibilities. But more importantly, you have real authority to make recommendations that I personally guarantee will be implemented." Susan, who had been quiet, spoke up. "If I may, as a flight attendant who's witnessed discrimination firsthand, having someone like Captain Wilson in a leadership position would mean everything to crew members who felt powerless to speak up." Reynolds nodded in agreement. "The rank and file will listen to one of their own in a way they never would to consultants or HR." Green didn't hesitate. "Captain Wilson, I've been in this industry for 40 years. I've seen a lot of PR problems come and go. This is different. This video exposed something ugly that exists within an airline I'm responsible for. I can either address it meaningfully now, or I can watch it destroy everything we built. So yes, I am genuinely committed." James took a deep breath. He had a decision to make, one that would affect not just his career, but potentially the experiences of countless passengers and crew members for years to come. "I'll do it," James said finally, his decision made. "But I have conditions." Green nodded, his expression serious but satisfied. "Name them." "First, this can't just be about race. We need to address all forms of discrimination: gender, age, religion, disability. Everything." "Agreed," Chen said immediately. "Second," James continued, "I want to speak personally with Karen and Steve. not to condemn them, but to understand what happened from their perspective. Johnson raised an eyebrow. You want to talk to the very people who discriminated against you? James nodded firmly. Real change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from understanding. And maybe they need to see me as a person, not just a passenger or a problem. Green looked impressed. That's unexpectedly gracious of you, Captain Wilson. My third condition, James said, is that I still fly tomorrow's London route as scheduled. I'm a pilot first. That's my identity, my profession. If I'm going to help lead this initiative, I need to remain connected to the job and the people it affects. Green exchanged glances with Chen, who nodded. That can be arranged, he confirmed. Then we have a deal, James said, extending his hand. Green shook it firmly. Thank you, Captain. Your leadership today will impact this airline for years to come. The meeting concluded with plans for a press conference the following week after James returned from London. As the room cleared, Reynolds approached James. Not many would have handled this the way you did, the older captain said. Most would have either walked away or demanded heads on platters. James smiled tiredly. Neither approach solves the real problem, and I've spent too many years hoping things would change on their own. As they walked out of the conference room, James was surprised to see a small crowd had gathered in the terminal. The teenage boy, Marcus, was still there with his father, along with several other passengers from the flight and what appeared to be a news crew setting up nearby. Marcus broke away from his father and rushed over. Captain Wilson, did you see? The video has like 1 million views. You're famous. James placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. Fame isn't what matters here, Marcus. It's what we do with the attention that counts. Marcus's father approached, extending his hand. Robert Taylor, my son hasn't stopped talking about you since he got off that plane. He wants to be a pilot now. James smiled genuinely. It's a wonderful profession. For people who look like us too? Robert asked quietly. James met his gaze steadily. Especially for people who look like us. The skies belong to everyone. A reporter approached with a microphone, but Chen smoothly intercepted her. Captain Wilson will be available for a full press conference next week. Today, he needs to prepare for his international flight tomorrow. As James was escorted to a waiting car that would take him to his hotel, he caught sight of Karen and Steve sitting in another conference room, looking subdued as they spoke with HR representatives. Karen glanced up and briefly met his eyes through the glass wall. James gave her a small nod, not of forgiveness exactly, but of acknowledgement. Her expression registered surprise before the car pulled away. At the hotel, James found his luggage had been delivered and pressed for tomorrow's flight. A gift basket from Green contained a handwritten note. The skies are yours, Captain. Thank you for helping us find our moral compass. James showered and changed, then sat on the edge of the bed. His phone had been buzzing constantly with notifications, messages from fellow pilots, friends, and family who had seen the video. There were interview requests from major networks and even a call from the president of the Airline Pilots Association. He silenced his phone and stood by the window, looking out at the planes taking off and landing in the distance. In 12 hours, he would be in command of one of those aircraft, responsible for hundreds of lives as he had been for years. That part of his life remained unchanged. But something significant had shifted today, for the first time in his career. As the sun set over the Atlanta skyline, James felt both the burden and the honor of the path ahead. The incident that began with humiliation had transformed into an opportunity for transformation. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important journeys begin with the most difficult departures. Tomorrow he would fly to London as planned. When he returned, a new chapter would begin, not just for him, but for every person who had ever felt out of place in spaces they had every right to occupy. Captain James Wilson took a deep breath and began reviewing his flight plan for tomorrow. Whatever changes lay ahead, the sky was still his home, and in the cockpit, he knew exactly who he was.